Let me take this privilege to invite Dr. Hiranmay Ghosh on this platform. He is a former research advisor and a principal scientist at Tata Consultancy Services. He received his PhD degree from IIT Delhi and BTech and BSc degrees from University of Calcutta. He has been invited to teach in IIT Delhi, NIT Surathkal, and IIT Jodhpur, as he also just uh, told this, as adjunct or guest faculty. His research interests include computer vision, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and cognitive computing. He is interested in book writing also. Currently, he has authored a book titled Computational Models of Cognitive Vision from Ville IEEE Press in 2020 itself, and he has already co-authored a book titled Multimedia Ontology, Representation and Applications by CRC Press in 2015. Besides, he has many research papers published in reputed international journals and peer-reviewed conference proceedings. Thank you, sir. Thank you for being with us. Over to you. Please continue with the session, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Jain. So, first and foremost, let me congratulate Dr. Jain for organizing such a great event with so many experts speaking, and I thank her sincerely for making a part of the program. And just a few words before I really start with my presentation. So, I have created my presentation in a few, about 9, some loosely coupled modules. I mean, there has to be coupling, we can't make them totally independent. And each about 10 minutes, maybe some a little longer, some a little shorter. And we'll go through them one by one, depending on time. We'll go a bit slowly, try to answer your questions, whatever comes on the way. And that way, I plan to take up this session. Number 2 is that as every module is a little quite small, around 10 minutes of length, I suggest that as we are going through the modules, if you have any questions, jot down in the chat box. At the end of each module, we'll come back to the chat box, have a look there, and try to answer all the questions. At that time, we may have a few minutes for interaction, that if there are any further questions or if there are any further clarifications needed, we can talk about that. And the last point is that maybe 1.5 hours is quite a longer time, particularly for these sort of online sessions. So maybe somewhere midway or at around 45 minutes, we can have a, if it is okay, we can have a short break for a few minutes, maybe 3 minutes or 5 minutes, something like that. So I hope that should be okay.
Yes, sir.
With all,
perfectly fine.
All right. So let me start presenting, and let me go ahead with the model.
Yes, sir.
I hope I am audible and my screen is visible to everybody.
Yes, sir. To me, screen is visible and you are pretty audible. So I hope it is the same for everyone.
So,
yes,
so
yes, sir. You can continue.
This 90 minutes that way. Right. So let me continue.
Yes, sir.
So in this 90 minutes that we have with us, I plan to take you through some perspectives of visual semantics. Now, this is a huge topic in itself, and look, it is very difficult to go through each and everything there. So we'll take up some glimpses of certain things. And as I said, that we have got 9 modules with us, including this introductory one. We'll go through them one by one. I mean, if it comes to it, we may skip some, or we can spend some more time on some. I mean, we have a more or less let the topic organically develop. That's my whole idea. So, what is visual semantics in the first place? The thing is, every picture, if you see, look at it, has a story to tell. If you look at the picture here, I mean, it is a stall somewhere, a street side stall, and lots of things are happening. Many people are doing different things. Somebody cooking, somebody eating, somebody chit-chatting, somebody pointing to something, and so on and so forth. And that story behind the picture is the semantics. So, what is the information, or what is the content it is trying to provide? A picture, one can view it is just some pixels, some splash of color here and there, but that is not what a picture is for. Every picture is there to tell you a story. And one more interesting thing is that a picture doesn't tell only one story, it tells many stories. And you give the same picture to some 10 different persons to describe, everybody will describe it in a different way. Like, actually, I've given this picture to a group of students to describe and see that how they do it. Some people concentrate on the place and the surroundings, like that it is a stall and it is some cooking is going on, some eating is going on and stuff like that. Some people concentrate on the humans. This person is doing this person is doing that, on the actions, humans and their actions. Some who are actually familiar with the place identified it as a street side shop in Chowpatty, Bombay, which I didn't know. And so he associates it with the surroundings of that particular neighborhood of Chowpatty. So the picture, not only the semantics of the picture, not only come from its content, that is what is there in the picture, but also from the context, where the picture is taken, when the picture is taken. Like, you must have seen many pictures during some wars, or even during the COVID situation, so that a picture of today tells the story of probably COVID. That is the context of it. Fine. So that is all about the semantics of a picture, or this may be also a video also. So this is visual semantics. But why do you bother about it? And let it tell, we perceive it fine, but by we here, I mean that we as computer scientists, as one who actually do some machine processing on the pictures and try to extract the meaning out of the picture. So the answer is very simple. The visual data is sort of omnipresent today. You look at social media, scientific, surveillance, news, and whatnot. And if you look at it, if you look at the collection on the internet, visual data by far exceeds text or numeric data in modern age. This has happened primarily after 2000s, with cheap cameras coming in, with huge storage spaces being available, like on the clouds, etc., and so on. I mean, this collection is increasing day by day. Earlier, till around 2000, the internet was dominated by text or other numeric data. And picture is just not for entertainment. It carries much of the important information as well. And hence we need to worry about it. Like I think all of you are familiar with at least one or more of these tools and an active participant in some of them. WhatsApp, yeah, I was in the morning session itself, I was thinking, somebody was talking about a WhatsApp group, etc., etc. I request for this group also, there is a WhatsApp group. We do lots of things. Maybe it is that whatever pictures get into social media, about more than 50% is about personal appearance and things like that. To be more precise, on selfies. So now that is not just for fun. It has some serious business behind it. The thing is, if we look at these things, Facebook, Instagram, Flickr, and stuff like that, they together have over 500 billion photos and videos. And they're just not for your entertainment. They are analyzed by computers for some serious work, like advertising and many other applications, which generate trillions of dollars of business. Okay? And also, that has some many social benefits. You can know what is happening where, etc., etc. Then another large share comes from the scientific data, be it astronomy, biology, neurosciences, medicines. These are some of the examples. There are many more. Also, to give you a magnitude, an idea of the magnitude, there is one project called Sloan Digital Sky Survey, which wants to, which has a goal to map the entire sky. It is one of the big tests taken from that project. That is that all the stars and Milky Ways and the galaxies, everything. And they have so far covered about 1/3 of the sky only. They have quite a few observatories in northern and southern America. And so far they have covered only 1/3 of the sky, and they have an ambition to cover the entire thing. And today that data size stands at 116 terabyte. Tera means 10 to the power 12. Okay. So it will easily multiply by 3 times, and when more powerful telescopes and things come, more and more data will be added. Similarly, all these biological database, neuroscientific database, particularly genomic database, they have got huge sizes. Surveillance. You must have heard about, besides the domestic surveillance or industrial surveillance, you must have heard about smart city projects. Where at every street corner, there is a camera. And I'm told that in UK, that is United Kingdom, there is this in the public places, there is about one camera for every 3 cities. That is in these, they monitor all the cities, etc., etc. And this is spreading in all countries, in our country also. In various cities, you will see this sort of street side cameras sitting there, watching at the neighborhood, watching at the streets, etc. Not only to check traffic violations and things like that, but also to see how traffic is building up, to suggest alternate routes to the people, and how to diffuse that traffic situation and things like that. Not only traffic, but also for crimes, etc., etc. They are very useful. But look at it. If you look at a video camera with a modest resolution of 1280 into 720 and operating at 30 FPS, the 30 frames per second, that generates about 7 terabyte data per day. And a smart city will easily have a few hundreds, if not thousands, of such cameras. So you can understand what is the huge amount of data that we have to delete. So the whole idea is that look, we are talking about the semantic web technologies, that how over the internet, what is semantic web? Semantic web is how we can build machine intelligence over the internet and how we can process data. Now, till 2000s or 2004, 5, something like that time, where this sort of, there was not much importance of the visual data on the net. They are confined to somebody's personal collection and things like that. But after 2004, or around after 2000s, this situation have started changing. More and more visual and data in other media form like audio, etc. You must know that there are lots of music on the web. So this sort of data started growing. And so naturally people thought about, so what to do about them? Can we extend the semantic web technology for visual semantics? So what needs to be done? Okay. So this is the thing where we dwell on this talk. So, what is the crux of the issue? Why visual data is different from the other data that we're talking about? First of all, volume of the visual data is huge. And some people call it the biggest of big data that people have ever known. So processing such data requires a huge computing power and memory, becomes very expensive. But you see, when you look at the human beings, we process visual data day in and day out. Our eyes are particularly capable of doing it. When we look at a scene, we instantly and intuitively make meaning out of it. We can know that what is happening around us, and our survival depends on that. Unless you find out, it is not only humans. Look at the animal world. A deer, he looks around, and if he senses a tiger, he will run away. A tiger, he needs to see his prey so that he can eat and survive. Right? So everywhere in the animal world, and all these things happen in real time. Suppose in a jungle, a tiger is looking at a deer, and look at the lots of clutter, all the leaves and trees and all these things are there. Out of that, a small deer, it can spot instantaneously. It should be able to understand the movement. It should be able to judge how to jump on it. And same here, same in the human life. We need to look at our surroundings, see what is happening, react to it, and we do it. It has to be always in real time, instantaneously. And that huge volume of data is coming into our eyes. So how do we do it? So the whole idea is, when we try to do it on a machine, can we learn from how the biological system or how the human mind process it? Now, the whole idea revolves around that the volume of data is very large. So can we somehow reduce it so that it is tractable, it is processable? So what is the useful part of the information that the human mind uses? Visual information. How to reduce data volume and still be able to extract the meaningful information? Can we model the human visual system? Can we model the human mind? So a major focus in data reduction is at the defined data processing. That's the whole idea, the whole approach. So aided by knowledge, reasoning, learning, all these topics of the semantic web. And that's how comes the cognitive sciences and semantic web technologies behind this visual data processing. Now, with this background, we'll cover the various aspects of visual semantics, and we'll look at a few applications in this talk. And just to acknowledge, much of this talk is built over my recent book, which is in turn a collection of work by many scientists around the world. And so the credit of the talk is not mine. It goes to all the scientists who have immensely contributed to development of visual semantics over the years. So that is the end of the module 1. So let's see if there are any questions on the chat box. Yeah, there are 8. Voice is not audible. Is it better now? Is there a problem?
No, sir, not at all.
Is there a problem with my voice?
Sir, the
I'll
voice is perfect.
I'll increase
Maybe
my.
the speaker is in low voice. It is perfect, sir. Please go ahead.
Shall I increase my microphone?
No, sir. No, sir.
A little bit more.
No,
All
sir.
right. All
Not
right.
required.
Okay. Now, visual semantics approach can be applied for scientific articles, text summarization. Yes, very much. It is not only in text summarization. That's a very interesting question. There are 2 parts to it. Any scientific article is not complete without some sketches and diagrams. So first of all, of course, these sketches and diagrams can be processed by the visual semantics approach. About text, look, whenever you are looking on the printed page, then of course the signal that you get is a visual signal. You convert it to text and then do whatever summarization you want to do. But nowadays, the relevance of that part is gradually decreasing because most of the text is there in the electronic form, and then there you don't have to do much of visual processing there. It is, you can extract the text from your PDF or whatever it is. Any other question? Okay, I think that's all. Is there any other question there?
No, sir.
Okay, then we'll move to our next topic. Okay. Okay. So, this topic, after saying what visual semantics means, we'll go to the 3 interesting topics in extracting visual semantics: perception, cognition, and attention. Well, what is vision? Now, vision has got successive stages of processing. First of all, when you look at the, what happens? You identify the objects that constitute the scene and you localize them. So what and where? There are 2 parts to the story. Like you see, there are 4 players visible. There is a ball. There is a goal post. You may also see the net. Here is a viewer's gallery. There is a fence. There is a ground, and so on. A few lines here and there, and so on. At the next stage, after you identify that, what happens? That you have a semantic interpretation. Like, after seeing this thing, probably you can interpret the whole scene as a football game. And you can see the particular event here is a free kick. Okay. And probably, I mean, you can have a prediction also that is probably going to be a goal score. And if you are in the viewer's gallery or even watching it in a TV, then there's an action selection. You hold your breath or you start cheering. Depends on which side of the game you are in. If you are a sympathizer of team A, you will do it one way. If you are a sympathizer of team B, you might do the other way. Okay. Now, look at it. So at the first stage, what we do, we see something, we identify and localize the objects in the picture. 4 players, ball, goalpost, etc., etc., and where their relative positions, the geometric organization of the entire scene. So this part is perception. From the visual signals that we get, we extract certain facts or beliefs about the environment. Okay? And then what we do, we try to infer something from the picture. At that time, we ignore lots of other information. Probably focus on these 2 players in this particular scene, look at the ball, their relative placements, the movements, I mean when the ball moves or when the player kicks, or the movement of the goalkeeper, and so on. So we deduce that it is a football game and it is a free kick, a player is poised to kick the ball, the goalkeeper is ready to defend. This way, we look at the interaction between the objects and we try to predict possibility of a goal score. Now, how do you make these inferences? So, of course, you need to have a background knowledge. Unless you know what is a football game and maybe some other games, you cannot identify it as a football game. You cannot identify if you don't know that there is something called a free kick and what are the rules of that free kick. You cannot identify it as a free kick, right? Also the experience, I mean, which is also a kind of knowledge, but I put it because if you know the history of the players, you may, their reputations, or what has been happening in this particular game for last whatever time you have been watching it, then you can make probably some better prediction of whether there is to be a goal score or not. If you know that the goalkeeper is very strong, probably you will think, no, I mean, he will defend it, you may tend to believe. Or if you know that this person who is making the free kick is a very strong fellow and very unpredictable fellow, you may tend to believe that there will be a goal score. So your deductions, your inferences, and your predictions depending on your background knowledge and experience. Okay, so that is one of the important points I want to make. Here, not much about these. Here it is the processing of the visual signals. Here it is the interpretation of what you have seen. Now comes to the topic of attention. So as I highlighted in the previous slide itself, that look, when you try to get the semantics out of a scene, you really do not look at the entire scene or all the objects that are present in this scene. But you look at only a minuscule portion of that. For example, presented this image to a group of people, it has been observed that people will mostly look at the center of some actions, like mostly here and here and here, to make out what is happening in this scene. They will seldom look at this place or this place on the sky or on the water. Like this is called a attention heat map, that it is actually when these photos are shown to some hundreds of people, ultimately it indicates where the people look. And if the white means, the increasing brightness means people looked more at those places. Darker places means people didn't look there. So look, these three places gets maximum attention. A little more on the other sides. So everything is concentrated around this, and primarily here, here, and here. Okay. So the first point on the visual semantics that I want to make is that the visual semantics is conveyed by a very small regions of a picture. They may be contiguous, may not be contiguous. They may be separated out like this. Okay, there may be some islands here and there. So that is called attention. And you can see now we have a hint for how to reduce data. That can we select these areas? How it is not a random selection, right? In random, sometimes we select here, sometimes we select here. But it is not a random selection. It is a very selective attention, and there are certain ways to do it. Now, we won't have much time to talk about the attention. So, we have already passed 30 minutes. Okay, we are running. So I don't know. So look at this. Here in this image, I mean, just like that, if you look at it, the red flower in a greenish blue background stands at it, and whether you look like it or not, I mean, whenever you look at the picture, your eyes will tend to focus on it. So this is an intrinsic property of the image. Even without whatever you want, or independent of your mindset, your attention or vision will be drawn towards the flower. It draws spontaneous attention. It is also known as bottom-up attention. In contrast, look at this picture. First look at the picture. Don't look at the text. So what draws attention? Maybe this building, or maybe some of the flowers. But if I tell you a spotted cat on the rooftop, then automatically what happens is your mind starts working towards the features of a cat. The tail, its body, and so on. And will tend to concentrate on this place where the cat is there, though it is not very prominent in the whole image. So this is dependent on the task given to you, that please find the cat, or maybe your intention, you want to follow the cat, you want to see where the cat is going. So it depends on your task, and this is known as the top-down attention. It is determined by what you want to do. And your cognition also depends on your intention. This is a street sense, probably in Delhi, or maybe in some other city in North India, I don't know. It may be Kurukshetra also. Okay, so, or maybe somewhere in Punjab. So what happens is that, look, if you are a shopper walking down the street, you will rather concentrate on what is there in the shop fronts and things like that. I mean, even people are brushing against you, not in these COVID times, but otherwise you will tend to ignore that. Okay. Or is it a picture time? I see a person is wearing mask here. I don't know. Probably it's this policewoman is also wearing a mask. So it is a picture from the COVID time itself. Okay. I need to see it earlier. But then, if your job is to drive down the street, of course, you will not look into the shop front. You will rather tend to look at the traffic. So what comes to your cognitive level, it depends on what you intend to do. What is the use of the information that the visual scene presents? Or two of us may look at the same situation, but two of us may have different cognition based on what we want to do, what is our intention at that point of time. So in summary, perception is interpretation of the sensory data. It may not happen only with visual data, it can happen with any other sensory data. It means acquisition of new information about the environment, sensors, making assertions about the environment. Different viewers can have different assertions, etc., etc. I won't go into details, and we are much running by time. And cognition is the experiential interpretation of the percepts. And attention is selective filtering of sensory data, can be bottom or top down. And most importantly, it results in reduced data and hence the reduced cognitive load. Lots of information gets filtered before it enters our cognitive system. So roughly speaking, this is a architecture for visual semantics, and when you really want to implement sort of an artificial robot or something which looks and acts, this sort of a architecture you may have to follow. From the environment, your sensory organs, maybe the eyes and whatever, will collect the data which leads to perception, which get filters to attention and goes to the cognitive level and gets interpreted by knowledge and experience. But strictly speaking, it is not a one-way process like that. Something more happens. For one hand, the cognition controls your perception, sensory organs, perception and attention. If you, recognize something, you try to get more data about it. Like when you see a crowd on the road, in the last driving example, you will really try to figure out that you see that what is happening exactly in front of you. Probably your attention is focused on the pedestrian who is just in front of your car and is about to be hit by you. Another thing that happens is your cognition, your knowledge and experience is not a static. Whenever you recognize new things, there is a learning and your knowledge and experience level changes. It gets updated. So that is in summary about the visual semantics. So as I said, scene can be interpreted in many ways. Depends on the intention and background knowledge of the observer. Like this is what some of my students wrote. Stall of some dishes, chopati, to at back. People sitting outside a shop for snacks, man cooking something, etc., etc. Scene of a tea stall, man is cooking, people sitting on stools. So you can see somebody focuses on the material objects or the context, somebody focuses on the activities, somebody focuses partly on the scene contents and also on some activity. People are sitting on stools, etc., etc. Now there are many layers of interpretation, like these long and yellow things, what you perceive. Ultimately, you may recognize them as bananas, or you may, even at a next higher level, you can associate them with food and health and even elation. Some people may be very happy to see the bananas, and some people may be unhappy also. The red circle that you see here, when you see that visual signal, you may just see a red circle, or in a black background maybe, or you can interpret as a traffic signal, but then you can also see as a stop sign, interpret as a stop sign, or it's a danger, or you can associate with a policeman hiding somewhere and ready to grab you if you violate it. You may interpret this as a human figure with outstretched limbs and with blue dress, or you can associate it with the dance form Bharatanatyam and associate with the expression of joy and freedom. So the visual signals moves through level of perception, goes to cognitive level, and the level which you can reach depends on background knowledge, your intention at that point of time, and your, experience. So that is the end of module 2. Let's see if there are again some questions in the chat box. The attention mechanism is based on intensity level of picture or video. This is a very, very involved question. Unfortunately, we may not have time to go through the attention mechanism here, but let me try to answer as the question is raised. First of all, it doesn't depend on intensity level. It depends on the local contrast in one way. That has been the traditional viewpoint. Local contrast may be in terms of change of intensity, not absolute intensity, but change in intensity in a locality. The change in color, like you have seen the example of red flower in the blue, green or blue background, and stuff like that. But the modern cycle that has been the viewpoint in late 90s and early 2000s. But in the modern times, the psychologists have done many experiments, and what they have found out that it is more than those microscopic image features of the contrast and color and stuff like that. What matters is the semantics of the object. Like, there are two types of properties which are believed to draw attention. Of course, the color and texture and all this also do, the local contrast also do. But the other two types of things, what they do is, one is the object properties, typically some convex object and things like that draw attention. Because convex object is sometimes associated with foreground object in certain background. Another thing is that certain things which are inherently has some semantics associated, they draw attention. For example, a human face or an animal face, text on a background. Any object which is touched by a human being, any object that is meant for viewing, like a TV screen, like suppose you are looking at a drawing room scene with a TV at a corner, your attention will focus on the TV screen, even if it is dark, or a computer screen, things like that. Or any object that is meant for being operated by humans. And those are the things which draws the maximum attention. And that is how the attention models, mathematical models for attention, which has been developed starting from late 1990s. I think the first known was developed in around 1998. From there, at that time, it was purely local contrast based. But then people are gradually moving to the models where these sort of object properties or semantic objects play a better, has more role to play. Any other question?
Even Mr.
Okay.
Dinesh Gopi.
So I'll take just a 2-minute break, have a sip of water.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, please.
I was just saying that Mr. Dinesh Gopi can even unmute the mic.
I'll just have a sip of water and come back.
If his intention, has he got the answer of the question?
so we are back. And
Yes, clarified.
if we take a time check, we have crossed 40 times and we have covered 2 out of 9 modules.
Okay.
So I'm sure we'll have to skip some. Let me decide which ones to keep.
Yes, sir.
Okay, done. Okay, these some modules here I cannot skip, but I'll really go a little fast on this, because this gives the fast stage of processing. I mean, when we receive our visual processing starts with our eyes, and neural network is one of the contemporary topics.
Yeah.
So how they correlate the eye and the neural networks, that is the okay. So if you look at the human visual system and look at a camera or the artificial vision system, it is a very crude analogy. We have image capture devices, okay, here, a pair of them, and there is a network in whatever form, right? Here it is a neurons, and it goes to a processing unit, brain or the computer. Now bear this analogy in mind, but there is much more to it. The eyes are not some simple image capture device. So we'll see what happens in the eye. Now, roughly speaking, ultimately the goal of the vision is from an image to create a description of the world. Like probably from this image, you will create the description like a tree on which there is a bird sitting and there are flowers, and the bird is pecking at the flowers. Flowers are yellow and the bird is green, and things like that. So, at the first place, some inverted images fall at the back of your eye, and those signals get carried to your brain, and there is a crisscross connection. So the left, whatever you see with the right eye, partly goes to the left brain and partly goes to the right brain. The red line here you can see, and similarly, what you see with the left eye partly goes to your left brain and partly to your right brain, and they get interpreted here, and then you can make this thing. The crisscross connection is responsible for correlating these two images. But okay, we are not to discuss much about the nerves and all these things. If you look at the structure of the human eye, in the front part here is sort of a lens, and with these muscles you can adjust your lens so that you can focus your vision on some whatever object you want to, but I don't worry about that part much. What I worry about is the back of this eye, where the images are formed, which is called retina. Out of that, a small area is called fovea, which is at the center of vision, and there is a blind spot from where the optic nerves come out and carries the information to the brain. Why it is blind is that any optic ray come here, you won't see that what is there. Fine? Because actually all over the retina there are some photosensors which captures the light rays and converts it to some electrical signals, and at this area such photocells are not there. So this is the cross section of the eye. Here are the photosensors. Light is coming from this way. These are very thin and transparent layers. So the light falls on here, on this layer. And so there are two types of photosensors called rods and cones. These are the rods, these are the cones. And then there are certain other crisscross connections. This sort of the photosensors are connected in a crisscross manner by various types of cells. And finally, the optic nerves carry this signal to the brain. I'll draw your attention to only one point in this, that for so many photosensors, there are just 3 optic nerves shown. That means whatever information is captured by all these photosensors are carried to the brain by these 3 pieces of optic nerves. That means there is a huge compression happening over this network here. Okay. And this is the first stage of our image compression that we have been talking about. So this is roughly the distribution of the cones and your rods on the retina. You can see the cones are there only at the foveal position, and then rapidly drops. And those responsible for color vision, and the rods are there. They are primarily responsible for black and white and night vision. They are spread all over the eye, but at the density gradually reduces as we move away from the center of the eye. Sensitivity of 3 cones, which types of cones will lead to color vision, but we forget about it for a moment. Now, here that retinal cross section is a slightly amplified view. Look at the photoreceptors. They are interconnected by horizontal cells, and some bipolar cells carry the information to the ganglion, and from the ganglions optic nerves go out. And here are the amacrine cells which connects the various ganglions. So this horizontal cell and the ganglion, the amacrine cells, they do something miraculous. So what happens is, let us first focus our attention on the ganglion, the horizontal cells, which connects the photoreceptors parallelly. Whenever a photoreceptor is excited, it sends some inhibition signals to its neighbors. Everyone does it. As a result, what happens is, if you look at the diagram, if you look at these bars, you may try to see that if you look at this bar here, left side appears to be a little lighter than the right side. Similarly, for this one also, left side is a little brighter than the right side, and so on. So, because of that action of the horizontal cells, what happens is, by the way, indeed, actually, all the entire bar, if you see separately, it has the same intensity all over the place. But what happens, because of the lateral inhibition, any portion of a lighter area which is closer to a darker area appears to be even more lighter, and vice versa. So across this boundary, though the entire stretch of this bar and this bar are identical in color or identical in intensity, if you look across the boundary, this portion looks a little darker and this portion looks a little lighter. So that results in a contrast enhancement. So this boundary you can actually see more, becomes more prominent. Same here. If you see here, this part across this boundary, this part looks to be a little lighter than the rest of the bar, and this part looks a little darker than the rest of the bar. But actually it is not so. All the bars are of each bar is of the same intensity all over. So this is a mathematical model of the lateral inhibition, which we will forget and go along to the next interesting event of the amacrine cells that connects the ganglions laterally. So what happens is here, but now one more thing is there. These bipolar cells which connect the photoreceptors to the ganglions, they behave very funnily. Some of them sends positive signals, some of them sends inverted signals. Like if this is bright, it will send a dark signal here and vice versa. But here, if it is bright, it will see a bright signal here. And these bipolar cells are not really organized. These positive and negative things doesn't happen at random. If you look at cross section, you will see they are organized in some sort of a concentric arrangement. Like here, at the left side, you see at the center portion, it is all the pluses, surrounding it all the minuses, and the other way around at the right side. Okay, at the center it is minus, and at the right hand side it is plus. The result of this is very interesting. Like if you see, look, the bipolar cells, some carry minus signal and some carry plus signals. And so what happens, so this is a cross section view. So what happens is, if there is a bright light falls here and dark light at the two sides of it, then it will the ganglion will have a very high response. Whereas if you see, if it is equally illuminated, the positives and negatives will cancel out and the response will be low. Similarly, by the way, I forgot to tell, so this is called on-center configuration and this is off-center configuration, where the center is plus, is on-center, and the center is minus, and the edges are plus, that is the off-center. So this is the on-center configuration. The off-center configuration, it will happen exactly the other way around. If the center is dark and the edges are bright, then there will be a large response and not otherwise. So that helps in actually detecting the edges, wherever the intensity is changing from light to dark or dark to light. And these are they can be oriented in this, they are called sort of filter bands, and they can be oriented in various directions, and then then you can reconstruct the edges, and that's how the object contours are detected. Okay, I think I'll go through this. I don't know whether the convolution I forget it, and this is basically what happens is, those of you who work with neural network, and particularly the convolution neural network, you will see that is nothing but an emulation of the human eye. These are the whole cross section is there, and there is a convolution bar that operates over the thing. Consider it as your retina, and these are the photosensors, and from the convolution mask operates over it, and the image gets progressively refined. And I will forget about the classifier and all that stuff. And that is how, at the first level, all the edges and the contours are detected in an image. So that is the end of module 3. Let's see if there are any. Intensity, yeah, I think there are no more questions. So shall I proceed, or there are some questions?
I don't think, sir, for this module there are any.
Okay, then let us proceed.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'll go through 4, then probably I'll skip a few, move to something else altogether.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think I should go through it. From the eyes, by the way, the eye was the first stage of human vision. That is probably some part of perception takes place here. But then we move to the brain and mind. So what is mind? That in itself is a big debate, but let us not go into that philosophy. Let us see that what are the attempts to model human mind computationally. Of course, there are many approaches. I'll describe just one of the approaches, which is gaining ground in the today's computational world, and let's say how it is. Now, in the morning, I know you people are having a little one session on the reasoning, etc. And these examples like bird can fly and whether penguin can fly and all these things we discussed. So I need not elaborate much on it. But many of us are familiar with this type of reasoning that is said that all birds can fly and parrot is a bird. We can infer that a parrot can fly. And this is called deductive reasoning. And in the morning, you have seen that if you say penguin is a bird, but unfortunately penguin cannot fly, so something is wrong, that simply points to that your premises are wrong, all birds can fly, that assumption is wrong, and hence your inference had been wrong, that penguin can fly was not true. So, by the way, let us not get into that right now. This mode of reasoning, where we deduce some unknown facts from it should be known facts, not new facts, is like these are the known facts and this is an unknown fact. We didn't know so far that parrots can fly, but we just deduce it from these two known facts in deductive reasoning. And this type of reasoning has been studied by philosophers since ancient ages, both in Indian philosophy and in Western philosophy. You will find mention of that, but it is formalized into rules of logic some 200 years back. Okay. Sorry, I think this is some problem with this slide. It does not work well for sensory data. I'll try to read out this portion. We know roses are flowers and they are pink. So if you see a pink flower, look, we know the roses are flowers and that they are pink. So whenever we see a pink flower, we can sort of infer that it is a rose. But we cannot arrive at it, or we cannot deduce it using the logic of that mode. I mean, here, this part left, what is missing here was rose. Rose is pink and rose is a flower. That does not imply flower and pink will imply rose, right? So this you might have learnt in the morning session. Secondly, it cannot handle uncertain sensory data. Many a times sensory data, what we are seeing, particularly things are occluded, there is low lighting, so we do not see it rightly, and so on and so forth. So, if the premises are in a deductive logic, if the premises, that is known knowledge, that is not known or incorrect, the reasoning will break down. For example, that birds can fly and penguin is a bird, penguin can fly. So premises are incorrect here. If we do not know that the birds can fly, we cannot conclude about a parrot flying, right? Now, since they are inherently noisy, sometimes they are not known when there is occlusion, or they can be incorrect because of various reasons, and hence we cannot use deductive logic for processing these sensory signals. It cannot generalize to accommodate new experience. I want just skip it through because that's a tricky issue. Now let us see how we even detect the simple object like a banana or an orange when we look at it. In our mind, we have, this is called model-based reasoning. In our mind, we have some models of banana. Its color is yellow, its shape is something like long, and maybe texture is something, maybe, okay. For an orange, its color is orange and its shape is round. Now, we try to, when we look at something, we try to match the observed data with the models of the known objects. And for sure, nothing will match exactly. Look, if I have captured this yellow color of the banana, all bananas are not exactly this yellow, right? Some will be a little greenish, some will be a little brownish, depending on their ripeness. Their shape may also change from the variety to variety. Here, in the orange, all the oranges will not be exactly round like this. And if you see, their textures will also be different. The colors also will not exactly match. So, we cannot get a perfect match. So, we'll have to make our judgment based on the best match of the observed data. If an object matches a particular model, then we accept that as our inference. Okay. So this is sort of a evidence matching. The visual features serve as the evidence of the for the objects. The reasoning based explanation is also known as abductive reasoning, and we generally use abductive reasoning for interpret not only visual data but all type of sensory data. Now, if you look at the properties of abductive reasoning, so we see colors and shapes. They represent known facts, right? I mean, this is what we are observing. So that is known to us. But that does not imply any particular object. Like if I say color equal to yellow and shape is sort of long or longish, it may be the banana, it may be the corn, it may be the boots. The matches are with whatever I observe, the match can be in various degrees. So, we discovered real new knowledge. The banana was not known to us. It was not implied by color yellow and shape long. This is something new that we discovered. Or the corn that is something new we discovered. So this is the major distinction from the deductive reasoning. In deductive reasoning, each can discover only the knowledge that is hidden into the knowledge base, which is implied by the knowledge base. But here we can discover the knowledge which is not implied by our knowledge base, that is of whatever we already know. But in the process, we can make a mistake. Given something yellow and long, instead of banana, we can think it to be the corn, and so on. And if you want to take a good example, look at this. These are zeros or 6. Okay. So you may not be necessarily correct in your inferencing. So this is called, your deductive reasoning is said valid in terms of logical terms, and in abductive reasoning, your inference may not necessarily be valid. That is, given the premises to be correct, your inferences may not be correct always. There is a need for prior assumptions. Like many objects share the similar visual properties. Just the analysis of data does not work. You need to have some prior assumptions. Like long yellow things which you see on the dining table are more likely to be bananas rather than the boots, and so on. I think we have a... So what happens is, ultimately, the interpretation of visual data is a sort of a tug of war between the belief and data. You have a prior belief that you have a prior model that it could be this or that, right? And the data updates belief. And stronger the prior belief is, more data, on the contrary, will be needed to update it. And if it is weaker belief, then it is susceptible to noisy data. I mean, just to give an example, suppose you strongly believe it to be a banana because we are expecting a banana somewhere, but it is actually a corn. So you will need more data to offset your belief. But however, initially if you thought, yeah, it could be banana or the corn or maybe something else also, then some small amount of data is good to tune your belief to that. But if it is noisy data, I mean, if the data is wrong somewhere, or then you are susceptible to making a wrong belief. Bayesian reasoning, okay, it is generally performed through sort of a network and through a belief propagation mechanism. I mean, we organize the facts in some sort of network, and then probably the red nodes are nodes that you can observe, and the dotted lines are where you can probably make inference, and you have some belief propagation in the network. That once you observe this, the belief in various other entities in the network keeps on changing, and so you make the your inferences. But I will skip it. So if that tug of war business, that if we can try to explain in a little more details, this left part of the figure you have already seen, that if you have to distinguish, suppose between the banana and an orange and some other fruits also, basically you have a model for each in your mind. The model results in sort of a probability distribution in the feature space, which could be color, texture, and maybe the shape, etc. Similarly for the orange. And then you see the data, and you see where in the data space it is falling. And then what happens is that, look here, one more thing I forgot to tell you, you have to have some sort of a prior belief for each of the hypotheses. Like you are more likely to have a banana, or you are more likely to have an orange. For example, if it is this season, in the current season, you may not have too many oranges. So today, probably on your dining table, you are more likely to have a banana than orange. And if it is a winter, probably you are more likely to have an orange than a banana. So these sort of priors you may have. And then you observe your data, you get some sort of evidence, and then this is a tug of war. Ultimately, you have the probability, posterior probability in a hypothesis, given the data, the observed data, which is basically a product is proportional to, with a proportional constant, product of the prior probability, that is what your prior belief was, and what your data says. It's a balance between your prior belief and the evidence. And at the end of the day, you have to choose the one which has the maximum posterior belief based on your prior belief and the observable data. That is how you make the inference. Now, this is called the Bayesian model of inferencing, and it is one implementation of the abductive model, abductive reasoning that we have talked about. And yeah, so that is one of the very fundamental things in extracting visual semantics. So let's again look at the question. PPTs, PDFs can be done. I think I'll leave it to the audience. I can share them with NIT Kurukshetra. Propositional logic premises follows conclusion using rules of inference. Yes, that is true. In the propositional logic, what happens? Premises follows conclusion. No, conclusion follows premises. What do you mean? Premises imply conclusion, right? In propositional logic. And using some rules of inference, that is true. You have the modus ponens and all this sort of stuff. That is true. And that makes it a valid logic. That is, if the premises are true, the conclusion will be necessarily true if you follow the rules of inference. But I have just explained that why it cannot be used for interpreting sensory data, and instead we have to do something else, right? Does it answer your question? Okay, let's move on to the next. I think I'll skip quite a few modules here. I'll jump to the last two modules I do not want to skip. So I'll move over to the modules 8 and 9. That is, this will be on knowledge for visual semantics, and this will be some application examples. If after that, if time permits, which I doubt, we can come back to some of the other modules.
Yes, sir. We already have 10 scheduled minutes, and we can have few more minutes.
Sure, sure. Let us try to do justice to the last two modules at least, because they will be of much of interest considering the focus of this particular event.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let us go to the knowledge representation. Why we need knowledge? We have been seeing that always, so far, whatever we have discussed, we have always traced on the way of reasoning, how we interpret and visual entity, that it is a model-based reasoning. You have to have a model of the object, then only you can interpret your visual signals and see whether it is fitting the model or not to interpret that image. Moving from bananas and oranges, moving to a little more complex example. This is the MRI of a segment of a brain, and it is apparently shows a brain tumor, which I'm not a medical professional, I cannot see. Probably it is this part, maybe, I don't know, or maybe it is this part. So it needs knowledge to interpret this image. What types of knowledge we need? We need two types of knowledge. One is medical knowledge, and one is knowledge about MRI. Why medical knowledge? That is, what is a tumor, how the tumor looks like, blah, 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 where it can occur, where it cannot occur, and things like that. And why knowledge about the imaging process, that is the MRI? Because we know that, if there is a tumor in the brain, through the image processing, how it may look like in this image. Okay. Now, question is, of course, having knowledge is something simple, but when we have to, rather than a human being, when you want a computer to do it, if you want a computer to automatically discover the tumor and probably classify it in some class from this image, then we need to see how to encode the knowledge formally. Of course, why we should develop an ontology, there has been a good bit of discussion in the morning. Now, knowledge is some sort of a very closely related with reasoning. So, I won't get into this, is basically a sort of a theory, sort of philosophical stuff. I'll just summarize it because that will be required for the next. So, what is the philosopher thought that what is knowledge? Knowledge is to be composed of named concepts. Some concepts named. Why named? Because when you named or labeled, why you have to label them? You have to label them so that they can be used to create some propositions, as in a propositional logic. There are other types of propositions as well, as we'll say. propositions can be used to draw inferences. You have you can manipulate the propositions, that you can reason with the propositions to draw inferences. Now the representation is different from what it represents. Forget it, that is a more philosophical debate. Okay, sorry, this line is repeated from the top. Okay. Now, thoughts, that is a reasoning, is also some representations. It arises out of dimension of the knowledge. And it is represented in a language similar to symbolic logic formally. So that symbolic logic we want to talk about, you have already seen it in the morning class, and you will see more of it in the following classes. In the morning, probably there was a little discussion on this sort of knowledge representation scheme like semantic network. And you see, this is a very simple graphical way to represent knowledge from this thing. The knowledge to be composed of named concepts, and names can be used to create the propositions. So if you look at it, each of the nodes in the graph represents a concept, and each of the links represents a proposition. Like if you see, the author one is a concept who has a name so and so, and book one is a concept which also has a title so and so, and etc. etc. And the proposition is book one is authored by author one. Okay. We can also see we set up some relations between the different concepts. But this sort of representation, like semantic network, it can be with different degrees of formalism. It can be absolutely informal. You allow absolute freedom that whatever you want you can put in these nodes, and whatever you want you can put in these on the edges, and then it is absolutely informal. But then different degrees of constraints can be imposed on that to build formalism over it. And one such formalism is the frame-based representation. Again, I won't elaborate more on it because you have already seen it in the morning, and you will see much more about it. Here, basically what we do, we have two types of things, classes and instances. The classes are bound by some rules which the instances are bound to follow, and there will be some exceptions are also possible, and some additional properties. The properties can be defined, and so on and so on. But now, when it comes to computer vision, this frame-based representation has a very powerful implication. Starting from a basic model of a chair, you can specialize it in various ways. Like a chair with a long seat will be a garden bench. And if it is without the backrest, then it becomes a stool. And if it is a little longer legs, it becomes a table. Fine. So when you can, so from a generalized concept, you can specialize many other visual concepts. Now, another aspect which I may need to discuss is this symbol grounding problem. So what it is, those of you who are familiar with expert systems, etc., you see ultimately any AI system ultimately operates with some symbols, some symbolic representation of the world. Like suppose we are talking about a cat, we may use the English word CAT, or it may be an icon also. It doesn't matter. Always it need not be an English word. It can be the Hindi word also. Okay. Now this symbol actually represents an object. This is different from the object. It represents, this is one instance of a cat. Okay, in an English form. Now, And the concept is that when you close your eyes and think about a cat, what you see? You think about a body shape, certain looks. You think that it mews, it has got whiskers and so on, its properties. So that is the concept. A concept is nothing but manifestation of some properties. So the concept is represented by a symbol, and the symbol materializes as an object. And in traditional AI systems, this object to concept translation is done by humans. So the AI system works only with these symbols. It doesn't have to worry about interpreting a visual image or something like that, sensory symbols. But suppose consider a robot, which is actually looking at the world and trying to make sense and operating on it. It needs to interpret the image and find out what the concept is. So, in the knowledge, that is representation, which is for computer vision, should include the relations between the concepts and their sensory manifestation. Now, this is a simple example to show we are running out of time, so I'll go a little fast. Maybe an automobile has an abstract body shape which specializes into cars and trucks. Cars have a body shape like this, trucks have a body shape like this, and so on. And there are many instances of cars and trucks. Then there are two types of spatial relation is also important. Like look at a room, then how are it is not only what, but where they are located. Like here is a study desk, there's a printer, there's a clock, etc., etc. is in the room, this storage area, and this is the study area, and so on. So there are two types of spatial representation. One is called a scene hierarchy, where we decompose the space into a hierarchical structure, like from a study room. It's a study area and storage area. The study area consists of desk, chair, calendar. Storage area consists of cupboard, bookcase, etc., etc. Or a scene graph, where we do not have a hierarchy, but we just see that, look, this object is close to that object. This is at the right of this object. The memento is in top of the bookcase on the right of the desk, and so on and so forth. And again, we have quite some time back, we have developed an ontology representation system, which is a syntactic extension of OWL, about which you will be reading quite a bit, but which sort of allows you to express the visual property, visual and not only visual or audio properties of the various concepts into the same ontology. So here are some examples which I won't try to elaborate here as the time is running out. So that's the basics about the knowledge representation for the visual semantics. So let's quickly check that. Is there any form of implementation process conversion semantic network into UNL concept? Really do not understand this question. Maybe, yeah, applications will come soon. So we'll come to the applications right now. I'll keep this question on hold. Maybe if it can be forwarded to me by some means, then I'll try to answer the question offline.
Yes, sir, I'll do that.
Okay, thank you.
And sir, there was one more question in the morning.
So last.
That is the difference between an ontology and a
Yeah,
frame. As you covered the frame system, so I like you if to answer that question, difference between the ontology and a frame system.
Look, ontology is a generic term. Ontology is basically representing a model of the world. And a frame or a frame-based representation is a very specific technique to represent an ontology. And ontology can be represented in many different ways, including effect. It can be a semantic network, it can be a rules, it can be, there are quite a few other representation scheme for ontology. Frame is one particular technique for representing ontology. Does it answer the question?
Yes, sir. To me, at least, actually, I do not remember the name of the participant who have
And anyway, I hopefully this person is also on the audience.
yeah.
Okay. So we'll quickly, we have run out of time, it is already about 4 minutes past. So
Yeah.
we'll quickly run through some of the interesting applications
Okay,
of visual semantics.
okay, sir.
First is what is known as computational photography. That is, how do you improve aesthetics of the photos taken? Like left hand side is a photo taken by a camera. On the right hand side, after some visual processing, how it looks like. Now you will see this type of applications in many websites, photo sharing websites like Flickr and Google Photos and things like that. Okay, see how the, it tries to understand the human perception process, human cognitive process, and tries to see that what to do to make this image more vivid. I won't go through the detailed explanation of it, which I wanted to make, but I only wanted to say that, look, if the entire colorful face is the model of all the colors that a human vision can see, then any device, particularly cheap devices, cannot capture all the colors. They can capture only a subset of the colors, which is enclosed in their rectangle. This is known as sRGB color plates. Basically, the color reproduced by 3 color guns, green, red, and blue. So if you are forming an additive model of, if it's a red gun, it is a green gun, and a blue gun, and if you are forming an additive model of the 3, you are confined to within the triangle. So that's the whole idea. So you do some, how in the earlier picture, how to achieve is that you have some tone mapping algorithm which sort of emulates the perception of a high definition image. Next is the intelligent cropping. You can take a photo, you can have lots of random things in that photo, which doesn't make the photo very attractive. So can you automatically crop it? So there you have to follow the human attention model to see what is the important object that deserves attention, and then crop it, keep it and remove all the other paraphernalia. But of course you cannot remove everything. You have to maintain some constraints for aesthetic qualities, like the aspect ratio. There are some good ratios, breadth is to height, placement of the objects, where the object is placed. If the tree is placed anywhere in the image, it doesn't look nice. Placement of the horizon, there are certain rules, rule of 2/3, that is said that horizon should be 1/3 way above the ground, and the object should be placed 2/3 in the horizontal direction and 1/3 on the vertical direction, and so on and so forth. So these are some aesthetic properties. Then many of you may be knowing about there are number of apps on the mobile phone nowadays, on smartphone nowadays, which improves your facial features. Not only facial features, but overall body features. So, this is motivated. There is a huge business around it because it is motivated by the trend of what I told, that about more than 50% of the social media content is about personal appearance. So what they do is they sort of change your skin color and tone. They work with the sort of all the wrinkles, etc., the texture, etc., do take care of smoothing out and tweaking of the facial expressions. Like if you look at the corner of the lips and the corner of the eyes, they have been modified in these 2 images. And even they toy with the shapes and contours of other parts of the figure and try to make the photo more attractive. Okay. Digital heritage. To restore the images which has been sort of mutilated because of aging or whatever. Now, in the earlier days, it was just images, cracks, etc. People used to sort of extrapolate and fill it in. That was, but nowadays people are trying to do semantic extrapolation. I'll explain that part. What is semantic extrapolation? If you see, despite significant amount of scratches, these images are reasonably well restored. Now, how? If you see, how is this is done through some semantics of the image. Look, if you just image feature-wise, like color and texture-wise, if you extrapolate, you will never find the eyes. If you know you are looking at the human face, you will know here are supposed to be the eyes, and of course, if it's a photograph lady, the eyes are supposed to be beautiful, so you can recreate the eyes. Same way about the lips. If you just extend the color or the texture properties, you cannot. Similarly here, if you from this image, if you can interpret it that it is a waterfall, and if you have a model of waterfall in your knowledge base, you can recreate the waterfall very easily. Now there is a little fun in the whole thing. Look, nobody knows whatever is there in the white areas. So neither does the computer programmer who is trying to recreate it knows, nor do the viewer knows. So nobody is any wiser. Whether it is correctly reproduced or not, what was the original sin, that is not the issue. The whole idea is the viewer should be made to believe that it is a original picture. He should not be able to spot the difference. Okay. Then we did some work with the ontology to create sort of a archive for digital heritage in the Indian classical dance, which is a huge ontology with various aspects of dance forms, in the sculpture, how they manifest, the scriptures like Natya Shastra and things like that, how they describe it, the myths surrounding the stories of Krishna and Mahishasuramardini and all these things, the locations of India from where different dance forms originate, musical instruments that accompanies them, some of the exponents in music and dance, and in different schools of dance forms and music. With all these things, this is a big ontology of Indian classical dance and music, and so that you can browse through a collection of videos semantically. Another interesting, I think I'll stop after one more slide. This is the last slide probably, and last but one. Social robots. Lots of robots are coming in the market which have to interact with human beings in very closed places. I mean, different from industrial robots, where they work in a place where humans' movement is restricted. Now, what is the consequence? Consequence is this space which is shared with humans is dynamic. I mean, things are moving around all over the time, like in your living room. Suppose you have a robotic janitor who will broom your room. Now, so the navigation plan, the robot has, in the cluttered and dynamically changing scenario of the drawing room or in your living room, it has to plan its movement properly, and that will have to depend on its vision and interpretation of what it sees. Then, effective interaction requires interpretation of the non-verbal cues. Look, these robots are being deployed for geriatric of child care, for companionship, as shopping assistants. So the robot should look at the facial expression of the person who is interacting with and decides on the action, like how close should it come. Look, if a old person who has suddenly fallen off, a robot comes to him and lifts him up, that is perfectly acceptable. But a shopping robot comes too close to you and may not be that welcome. It should maintain a social distance. Okay. And of course, that will be revealed by the facial expression of the person who is interacting with. A robot should take the visual cues and understand and decide what to do. Another interesting is the mutual and shared attention. When somebody is talking, the robot should look at him and should follow his gaze. Suppose this fellow is pointing to something else with his gaze and want to say something about it. The robot should also move its vision and look at that way. It also requires a very sophisticated understanding of the visual signals that he gets. A last example is content repurposing. That when you are transmitting the visual content of low bandwidth networks, and you try to like this of the thing, the thing is, anyway, nobody will look at the whole scene. As we see, the attention people will look mostly here, and mostly here, and mostly here. So why take the trouble of sending everything with equal resolution and waste your bandwidth? So if you do normal MPEG-4 or H.264 coding, it will like this. We will put more resources in these sort of areas where there is sort of a texture, etc. Also, look, wherever there is texture, it is putting in some more resource, but which is really not required. So if you do some sort of a perceptual coding, you know that people will anyway look into at the center of action. Then you can spend more resources here rather than at the periphery. And that's how you can save enormous bandwidth cost, and given the bandwidth, you can give a better experience. So thank you everybody for your patient listening. So I think we should stop here. We are 15 minutes past the time, and I think I had the privilege for the goodness of the NIT Kurukshetra team, and probably I was at the last presenter of the day. So that's all from my side.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I think there is one or more queries, but we will text you or we'll send you by email some of the queries which are left. If there is anything very urgent somebody wants to ask, you can unmute
okay,
yourself.
I think then.
If something there is very urgent, then you can unmute yourself. Otherwise,
okay,
we will discuss with email also. Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your nice words, and I hope it was happy learning for the participants. Thank you, sir. Thank you for today. And we'll start the tomorrow sessions at 10 o'clock in the morning. And there is an announcement for the participants to kindly join with the same email ID and name as you have registered on the Atal platform. So let us meet tomorrow at the same venue at 10 o'clock in the morning. And just remember one more thing, that is we have 3 different meeting links for morning, afternoon and evening sessions. So I hope there are no confusions, and all the 3 links are in the session plan also, and WhatsApp also, email also. We have sent all the 3 separate links always. So morning session link, afternoon, evening. So be in the same meet room that is required. Okay, thank you so much. So bye for now. Have a good day. Bye-bye.